Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. In this episode, I'm very happy to bring the conversation I had with Geoffrey Cohen. Geoffrey is the James G. March Professor of Organizational Studies and Education and Business and Professor of Psychology at the Graduate School of Business at Stanford University. He has a bachelor's in psychology from Cornell. He has his PhD in psychology from Stanford University. And he's also held appointments at Yale and University of Colorado at Boulder. Much of his work is focused on behavioral change, on the psychology of self and belonging, and something he calls situation crafting. He's heavily influenced by the work of Kurt Lewin, who we talk about in conversation. And he is the author of the new book, Belonging, the Science of Creating Connection and Bridging Divides. And that's the book that we talk about in this conversation. We start the conversation by talking about Kurt Lewin and his ideas of situation building. Kurt Lewin, as we talk about in the conversation, was this psychologist that really instrumental in social psychology, and he has some implications in industrial organizational psychology, where he believed that the person is always interacting with the environment and that the situation that is created is highly salient. And so we talk about Kurt Lewin and the importance of the environment. We talk about the individual versus the collective and why people seem to have this dichotomy that has to be either or. And we talk a little bit about that. We talk about the 5 vital resources for social change. Belonging uncertainty, which is a phrase him and his colleagues have coined. We talk about belonging and identity, how these two are connected and linked. We talk about us versus them. This is a big topic that comes up in many contexts nowadays, especially in terms of polarization and tribalism, etc. We talk about some interpersonal dynamics and how perception is really, really important. We talk about belonging and cooperation and how those things have a lot of positives, but that they can also have a lot of negatives. Well, they don't have inherent, kind of these moral attributions of good or bad. They can be used for good or bad things. So we talk about that. We spend a lot of time talking about the fundamental attribution error, which is largely in his book as well. We also talk about the actor-observer effect, self-serving bias, and many other similar ideas. We talk about a little bit stereotypes and biases. And then we talk about at the end, kind of as his book does, these last 4 or so chapters, we talk about how, this kind of pragmatic approach of here's all these really good things about belonging. Here's the data, the science, some of the theoretical constructs, but how do we apply this? How do we see the pragmatics of this? And so in his book and in the conversation, we talk about how would we foster belonging in schools, in the workplace, and in one's community. And so, and then we just talk about, practical ways of fostering belonging overall in our daily lives. This was such a wonderful conversation to have. Geoffrey is a very, very, very nice person, and he was so kind with his time and his energy. And it was, as I say in the conversation, it's always nice to talk to people in the world of psychology. It's kind of home base for me. And so this feels very conversational much of the time, which I always enjoy. And so I had an absolutely wonderful time. His book is fantastic. And now I bring you Geoffrey Cohen. I'm here with Geoffrey Cohen. Geoffrey, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you, Xavier. I'm excited to be here, and I am too.
Yeah, no, it's. I think we'll have a really nice conversation. You've written a fantastic book. The book is called Belonging. It's a great title. It's a simple. I love the cover too. The Science of Creating Connection and Bridging Divides. So obviously it was an eye catcher for me. So obviously we'll talk all about the book. But before we do that, just tell listeners who you are, what you do, your background, what you study, and how you came about writing the book.
Well, I'm a social psychologist by training, and so that means that I study how social situations shape the way people think and feel and behave. Right now, I'm a professor at Stanford University, and that's also where I did my graduate training. I've long been interested in this topic of belonging, partly because I think as a kid growing up, I was very shy, and I know we all feel this way, that in points in our lives that we feel like outsiders. And for me, one of the appealing things about social psychology was that it was, to some degree, all about the psychology of being an outsider and what we can do about it.
Mm. Yeah, I mean one of the things that's so nice about people that do social psych is that you're really interested in human behavior and people, just groups of people and how they connect and get along and how the interaction is. And so I'm in the clinical psych world, and so for us, we like people too and human behavior, just the one-on-one though, for the most part. So
I mean, you probably get that question all the time of, "Are you analyzing me?"
Yeah. So I do still get that. And I always tell people, of course I'm not, but of course, or I'll say, yeah, of course I am. So, I like to be playful about it, but
I always say, I'm really not. I always say, no, I'm not analyzing you. I'm analyzing the situation.
Right. Yeah. Well, I tell people, I was like, look, I do that all day. So I don't want to do that in my off time. I got to take the hat off. I mean, I don't want to be always working. So yeah. Okay. So, the book, again, like I said, is great. And of course, when I thought of it, the first thing I thought of was that kind of big paper. I think you mentioned it in the book. I can't remember at the moment. Need to Belong by
Roy Baumeister and Mark Leary.
Baumeister. Yeah. Baumeister is the one. Goodness me, that has to be coming up at least 25 years old. That paper now. I think it was the mid-90s.
I think that's about right. I think it was 1995.
Yeah, the mid-90s. So it's wild. I mean, I read that in grad school. I mean, it's like a huge paper everyone has to read.
Oh, you read that in grad school too? Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. It was a big paper. It was great.
Yeah. I agree. It was just such an important paper for the field, but also for me personally.
Yeah. So I mean, I'm sure we'll get to it and talk about some of it, but. So I guess I want to just first talk about, to kind of start off with some of the stuff you talk about in the beginning of the book, which is you mentioned somebody that might not be as familiar to some folks, Kurt Lewin. So Kurt was he's in a bunch of different places. He's obviously in social psych, but I see him in the industrial organizational literature as well. He's in a bunch of different places. So you just tell us briefly about, who he is and the importance of his work, and then how much he was a big impact on your thinking as well.
Sure. He was important because he was the founder of modern social psychology. It's very hard to underestimate the impact of his importance. Just by way of some biography, he was a refugee from Germany, fleeing Nazi Germany, and he had watched as the Nazis ascended to power and transformed this otherwise civilized modern society into one of the most brutal and evil regimes ever. And that was, I think, a guiding concern for him, is understanding how this could have happened and what could be done about it. And so his whole philosophy was kind of contrary to a lot of people at the time. Most people ascribed the Nazi regime to an authoritarian personality, that there was some sort of inherent or innate proclivity that Germans had because of their upbringing or whatever to be obedient. Lewin said, no, what the brilliance of the Germans was their orderly rearrangement of the daily situation of being a German, beginning with the youth groups that kids start, I think, at age 6 and going all the way up to the military and their control of the judicial system, their control of so many aspects of government and daily life that reshaped the German psychology. So his whole idea was the power of situations rather than personality on behavior. And he developed this field called social psychology, which was dedicated to the study of the power of the situation.
Yeah, you talk about in the book of this idea of situation building, right? And why that's really really essential and things like that. So, maybe describe situation building, and then how was it that he was trying to not necessarily create culture, but to kind of have this understanding or organization of where the situation that people find themselves in.
Yeah, Lewin was very interested in creating novel situations. So in contrast to a lot of other social sciences at the time, which focused on analyzing and describing what Lewin did was to create new situations that created new possibilities for human relating. And one of the things one of the levers he pulled was the group to which people belonged. And Lewin had this idea, a very powerful idea, that groups are more pliable than individuals. That is, it's easier to change a group and to carry along the individuals in its current than it is to change the individual against the tide of the group. And so a lot of Lewin's research showed the transformative capacity of changing the groups to which people's reference groups. And so he would do these little studies where he might put people in a totally different reference group and show that they were more pliable than they were in isolation when they were subjected to, say, a persuasive appeal to change. He would look at eating habits or factory workers, getting them to be more engaged at work and more open to changes in the workplace structure. He would show that actually one of the most effective things you can do is to craft situations in a way that take people out of their existing reference group and put them in a new reference group that opens them up to new possibilities and new norms.
Yeah, what I've read him at various points is this idea of that the person is always having some kind of interaction with the environment, whether you recognize it or not, whether it's a created environment or kind of an already kind of environment that's been, I guess, pre-assigned. I remember I'm forgetting the name of this at the moment. There were these 4 kind of modes. It was approach, avoidance. Oh goodness. Approach, avoidance, singly, and then double approach, avoidance. So is this ringing a bell? I'm sure you've read this and all these things.
Approach, avoidance, approach, avoidance, conflict.
Yeah. It's the intra-individual conflict or something like that. I forget the name. Something like that.
Yeah, this is all going back to like Clark and Hall, I think. We're going way back now.
Yeah. So, but basically that...
Maybe not as far back as Lewin.
The idea is that there's this way in which there'll be different kinds of quadrants of how people interact with the environment. They might have something that's a very easy situation, approach. There's something that's difficult situations, this kind of avoidance, and then you have this approach avoidance, both with a single event or two events, where people are trying to figure out in their environments how do they interact with other people, how do they make certain decisions, and that can cause a lot of kind of dissonance, where it's like, okay, people are unsure of how they want to do things. So, kind of giving the background, it makes sense why he would be interested in these things.
That's right. Excuse me. I think one of the things that we underappreciate, especially in our kind of Western individual society, is how much circumstances matter in shaping who we are. Who we are is entangled with where we are. And that's the lesson of social psychology. I think one of the discoveries of social psychology is that we often get it wrong when we try to explain and predict and support other people. We think that really what drives behavior is what's inside of them. Their traits, their character, their abilities. And sure, to some degree that's true. But what we systematically underestimate is the importance of the circumstances that people are dealing with right here and right now. And what Lewin was interested in doing was in altering people, their behavior, their thoughts, and their feelings by putting them in novel situations. So rather than as is often the case, thinking that, yeah, the way I'm going to change someone is to go in and fix their attitude or teach them a new skill or teach them a new ability. The focus of a social psychologist is on creating new lived experiences, new situations that open people up to change. And there's a whole suite of examples of these that have been demonstrated, the power of situations to transform people. And I think it's a useful corrective to our culture where we really just kind of, of course, virtue, character, abilities are important, but we think that those matter far more than they actually do. And we think that the situation doesn't matter nearly as much as it actually does.
Mm. So there's one, I guess, main question I have on this part that becomes, people see this as a type of dichotomy. I don't, and I don't think you will either, but rooted in what Lewin was thinking, many people will have this idea of, well, there's the individual and there's the collective, right? And we kind of siphon ourselves off into these kind of either or categories, right? And obviously it's both, but some people will emphasize, or I should say overemphasize one or the other. So I guess how do you whether you're using his kind of ideas within situation building or just more generally your thoughts on your research, how do we understand what it is about the individual, and that's important in how we emphasize that, but also how do we understand the collective or the situation or the environment or how we're socialized, et cetera? How do we find that, kind of healthy marriage between those two?
Ironically, the best situations are the ones that create the space for each of us to be who we are. So it's connected in that way. One of the things that I have thought a lot about is how to craft situations where people really do feel like they belong and feel accepted for who they are, both at school and in the workplace, even in our politics. And one of the key elements of situations that are there to support people's sense of belonging is the experience, the psychological experience that people have that, hey, I can be my full self here. Mm-hmm. Who I am is seen. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's related in that way that the situations that create the most belonging, that open people up to contribute the most, are the ones in which we feel that our individuality is seen.
I guess the one question I have with that is that when we enter a situation, now you could look at life as a series of situations that are happening, right? You can look at this in different ways, and that starts to get more in the philosophical side of things. But I guess if you're in an environment and you have, let's say you have like a type of a prototype or a script of what's going to happen for that situation, yeah, and we can't always manage or control the situations we're in, right? So if I go to the doctor's office, if I'm in school, if I'm at work, if I'm, even in my community, I can't manage the situation. I can only manage, in theory, myself, my reactions, my impulses, whatever, within that situation. So this is, how much do people really have some type of ownership in that, and how much is it dependent on other people kind of also doing some element of that?
Well, I think that we do have some influence, usually at least a little more than what we're currently making use of. One of the ways we have an influence is just in the way we see the situation we're in. So I would give these two answers to your question. The first is, we do have some agency in how we see the situations we're in. And for instance, whether we see them as opportunities for growth or not. And there's research that shows that, for example, when we see a situation as an opportunity for growth, we are more likely to benefit from the experience, to learn from it, and to deepen our understanding than if we don't have this kind of growth mindset, what Carol Dweck calls a growth mindset. So there are kind of filters that affect the way that we see situations that we have some agency over. One of my favorite examples of this is work by Chen and Miller on what's called the shift and persist mindset, where they find that for many economically disadvantaged youth, the one thing that helps to predict whether or not they grow up with fewer with less damage to their biological health is whether they have this shift and persist mindset. That is, when faced with adversity, they shift their perspective to try to find a silver lining, and they persist. They focus on the future. What can I gain from this experience that could help me down the line? And that shift and persist mindset ends up predicting much less biological damage due to early hardship and adversity, including economic, for these kids than as compared with kids who don't have that kind of mindset. So one of the most influential, one of the parts where we have the most agency is in the filter that we have, that we apply to our situations, and whether or not we look at the situation through a filter of growth or not. And I think that's one example. And of course, the abject poverty, objective circumstances matter a lot, but there's always a little bit of niche for us to exert some influence over how we are seeing the adversity that we're facing right here and right now. As Viktor Frankl talks about in his great work, Man's Search for Meaning, even in the darkest circumstance, we can carve out a little niche of purpose that helps us get by. And he survived the concentration camps.
Yeah, I mean, we're definitely purpose-seeking and purpose-making creatures. So I firmly agree with that, and I do like some of what you were saying about that research. It sounds very novel in some ways. But
the second thing I would add to that is that one of the things we also have is the ability to shape situations for others, and this is easy to underappreciate. In any situation, we are part of it, and through our actions, we affect it, especially for other people. And one of the things that I've been interested in is how much we underappreciate the impact of the little things we do down on the ground in our day-to-day encounters that can have a pretty big effect on people's sense of belonging. So that's the second way, I think, in which we have a little bit more influence on the situations we're in than we typically think. There's our filters, but there is a kind of superpower that we have in our ability to shape other people's belonging, even in the most mundane of encounters.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right, and I think it's a lot of this stuff is trying to have folks kind of recognize some of that, and so I think that's the impact and how they are influencing others around them, etc. You talk about in the beginning of the book these 5 vital resources. I believe it's time, participatory process, reference groups, self-affirmations, new groups. Maybe just tell us about kind of what these are and what makes them vital, I guess, as resources for trying to create situations or to belong.
Yeah, usually when we think of trying to exert an influence on people, we think about persuasion and attitude change. I should bombard this person with information and arguments. What Kurt Lewin emphasized are sort of social elements of situations that we can leverage for change. And I broke it down into 5. One is participatory processes, situations that involve people in their own transformation rather than our top-down are much more effective. Reference groups, we've talked about already. Much of the time, it's easier to change a person's psychology by taking them out of an existing reference group and putting them in a new reference group. Self-affirmations, this idea pioneered by Claude Steele, that one of the ways in which people come to open up to change is by feeling that sense of dignity, feeling affirmed in the situation, like they're psychologically safe. And when we're kind of in that state of self-affirmation, we're much more open to change than when we're defensive and self-protective. And then finally, social roles. Much change often comes from these new roles that we find ourselves in. The power of social roles. Like when I became a parent, that was a new role, and I had to live up to it, and it changed me in a number of ways. But also, even little roles that we find ourselves in, where people are, for instance, randomly assigned to be in some research that I did with Greg Walton. We randomly assign them to be in the numbers group rather than the letters group. And we find that people, when they're assigned to the numbers group, are suddenly more interested in math and persist longer at a math puzzle. So I would say that, and then also time. A lot of time change takes time. And one of the key places to intervene to affect change is at the beginning of a process, especially transitions into college or into a new workplace or into a new community. So these are the five, what I call the five vital resources for affecting social change and for crafting situations for the better: participatory processes, reference groups, self-affirmations, roles, and time.
Yeah, I see them when I was reading this part in the book. I saw them as types of like kind of ingredients of sorts for people to have either an active or proactive way of doing things, as opposed to a reactive way of saying, well, something's happening and now I'm responding to it in a kind of a after the fact reactionary way. It seems like more of the ingredients for either or kind of as it's happening or kind of proactively. So I thought that was very, very nice.
Yeah, just to give you one example, one of the things that colleges are really interested in now is creating a sense of belonging for new freshmen.
Sure.
And the tactic of just saying you belong here, a sort of persuasive, tactic.
Here's our
doesn't
mascot,
really work too well.
And, our mascot
right.
and our team colors and whatever. It's very hard to artificially kind of do that.
Exactly. By contrast, what really does seem to work, again, this is with my close colleague Greg Walton, is sharing stories from upperclassmen about what that transition to college was like and how almost everyone felt a little insecure during that transition, but with time things got better. So you share stories, but then you have people reflect on how those stories are relevant to them in their own lived experiences. So we had people reflect on those stories and integrate them into their own lives and point of view. We involve them in the process of their own attitude change, and found that was a very effective way to get the message across.
I'm not sure if this is what you're kind of alluding to, or if you've already mentioned it, but you talk about belonging uncertainty, right? Which I thought was really interesting. And you talk about this social belonging intervention. I don't know if it's something you've already mentioned, but what does that show us? And maybe just tell us about this kind of belonging uncertainty that people may feel or find themselves in.
Belonging uncertainty is what the term implies, which is an uncertainty about whether we belong. And we experience this all the time. As human beings, we're exquisitely attuned to whether we're accepted, whether we're respected in a social interaction. But it's especially acute in these transitions where we're trying to figure out, can I make it here? Do I really belong? Do I even want to belong? So belonging uncertainty is this psychological state that we're often in where we're just unsure. It's not a certainty, like I don't know for sure that I don't belong, and I don't know for sure if I do belong, but we're kind of wavering. And when we're in this state, we become vigilant. Some part of our attention is dedicated to trying to assess the evidence. Is this a place where I do belong or do I not? And in that state, little things can loom large. I remember there was an interview with Michelle Obama, who was, I think, the first in her family to go to college, and she attended Princeton University. And one of the things that she commented on was how when she got there were just all these strange tropes that didn't make much sense to her. And she didn't have fitted sheets and wondered if not having fitted sheets meant something about her ability to fit in here and belong. When we're in this state, we're just kind of almost like in a kind of tunnel vision focus, really poised to find evidence that helps us to resolve our uncertainty one way or another. Now, what that means, though, is that there's an opportunity for intervention. If you can tip the scales in a little bit in the positive direction, you might be able to ease belonging uncertainty and set people on a better course. And that's what we did in the social belonging intervention.
I want to. You're kind of leading me to the next thing I want to ask about. That is it's connected, but I guess there's this idea, and maybe we'll get to it again at some point, but. This is as you were saying that, I have this question that's kind of percolating in my mind is, what is it? I have like 4 questions at once.
That's good.
Okay. The first thing is, can somebody be a part of, let's say, a group and not feel like they belong? So I'm looking at more of the experiential or subjective experience of that. Yeah. And that might again go to their cognitive ideas about what constitutes belonging and not belonging. And then could you, I mean, I'm going to assume the answer is yes. Could you belong to one group or one situation, but not feel that way with other groups or other situations? So it's not like this panacea, right? It's like, well, I feel belonging here, but you don't feel it in all these other places.
Well, that's such a great question. I mean, don't you feel that? I mean, it's always a little bit of an open question. Your belonging is never fully resolved, except maybe when you're at home. You know, in the true sense of the word. You feel at home, you feel like the question of belonging is it's a bit settled, right? It's settled. And I don't have to really think about that, which opens my heart and mind to other things. I can start to focus on learning and opportunity, advancing myself and helping others. I feel like it's just never quite fully resolved, though, in much of our lives, because we're always entering these strange and unfamiliar settings, I think, at least periodically. New workplace, new school, even just out and about on the street in a random encounter. There's always a little bit of belonging uncertainty, going to a social gathering or a party. So I do think that it is a situated thing. And I recall, just to kind of riff off your example, when I was in graduate school, well, I'll ambiguate when this was, but I remember I had a mentor who was incredibly critical. I learned so much from this man, but he was one of the most dour individuals I ever worked with. And he would never give any smidgen of positive feedback. And I could be doing pretty okay, feeling like I belonged and pretty confident in my skills. But then I would have a meeting with him, or a weekly meeting. And pretty soon I would start to feel like, wow, maybe I don't belong here. And you feel yourself, I felt myself like flailing in this meeting, trying to do something, say something that would generate a positive reaction from this person, but none was coming. So that was my experience. And I would notice that after this meeting, I would feel dejected and start entertaining, alternative career possibilities, like opening a cafe in Mexico or something.
Yes.
And I was just amazed at how my psychology would shift 180 degrees as a result of this sort of single meeting. And I think that to a large degree, especially before we're established, as we often, are seldom established in many arenas of life, we're pretty, the situations can shape our belonging to a dramatic degree.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking of one experience in particular where I felt the exact same way. It's like, I feel like I'm doing okay. Like, and I had this very hard supervisor, and it turns out, he was fantastic, and I learned so much from him, and it was great. And I kind of needed that, but I felt, it was just kind of a tough period, where I was at. And I needed him to throw me a bone, and he just gave me nothing. I got no positive feedback. It was always like, going in, and I think I'd be like, okay, I think I kind of did this right, and he'd be, okay, so what did you do wrong here?
Right.
Well, why did you make this decision here? Well, why didn't you do it this way? And eventually I was at some point midpoint where I just kind of broke, and I was just like, I don't know what I'm doing. I shouldn't be here. He was like, it's fine. Why? What's wrong? You're great. I'm like, that's like the first thing you said, it's just so like, pushing, and it can feel that way, even if it's obviously, or maybe not so obviously true.
I think that's a lovely example of so many things. One goes back to what we were talking about, the power of filters, right? Your cognitive prism. You could have changed that situation by looking at it through this growth mindset lens, perhaps, and seeing the negative feedback or the critical feedback as a gift rather than a referendum on your ability. And to some degree, as a lot of research suggests, these prisms can be taught, but shifts in our perspective come about through changes in our situations. You can't just will that change of perspective. You need the advice of friends or some experience that opens you up to looking at that situation that way. So there's a little bit of room for agency in dealing with those situations so that they're less threatening to belonging by changing our cognitive filters on them. And then the second thing is just how easy it is for us to forget as educators, in the case of your mentor, in the case of my mentor, that our messages may not come through.
Mm-hmm.
We may really believe in a person's belonging. We may really believe in a person's ability. We may really intend our critical feedback as just that, an opportunity for this person to learn and to grow. But it might not be received that way. And especially in our diverse society, where there's such a wide range of sensitivities and backgrounds, there's so much opportunity for misunderstanding. One of the things that my own mentors and I, Claude Steele and Lee Ross, looked at was exactly that kind of situation where you're giving a person critical feedback across some fault line. It could be racial lines or gender lines. And one of the things that happens in that situation is that people often misconstrue the critical feedback. They see it as a sign of potential bias against them. However, if the mentor just simply makes their intentions explicit, I'm giving you this critical feedback because I have high standards and I believe in your potential, well, some of that ambiguity can be resolved, and people can benefit from the feedback. It shifts the way they see it. And in one study, we found that just getting that kind of feedback from your teacher, this was in middle school students, increased the percentage of ethnic minority students who revised a classroom assignment from 17% to 71%. And so I think there's two lessons in that story that you gave. One is that, our filters matter, but another message is that sometimes in our positions of authority and influence, we forget that our intentions may not come across as clearly as we think they are.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that, when I work with people clinically in therapy, that's one of the things that I'll say is, I think I said it this week at some point, of it's okay to say if you're in a conversation with someone or you have to have you're trying to settle something, to start the conversation saying, okay, I want to let you know, like, this is what my intention is here, or this is where I'm coming from. This is what I want to say. You can do it on an interpersonal level, but obviously, in a social context too, because it's one of those things where it's like, that kind of will lower the temperature of sorts.
Yeah.
To say like, okay, like, this is a hard topic, or this is a hard conversation. And if it does get a little spicy, you can say, okay, like, maybe I'm coming out wrong or whatever, but like my intention is still here, like I said at the beginning, and I'm still there. And, it can, I'm not saying it's going to make it, a walk in the park, but it could definitely lower the temperature though, of sorts.
Definitely. I think a lot of times we don't clear up what social psychologists call the attributional ambiguity.
Yeah.
One of the things we're just very sensitive to is, why is this happening to me? Why is my boss saying this? Why is my friend telling me this? And you can do a lot of good by clearing up your intentions, making them explicit rather than leaving them implicit. There's a nice little study by Tori Breskel, who looked at this in the context of gender stereotyping, where she found, because of negative stereotypes, that corporate leaders who are women, when they get angry, they take a hit to their status. Male leaders, when they get angry, their status goes up. But for female leaders, if they get angry, they take a hit because they're seen as a hysterical woman in light of the stereotype about their gender group. But she found that when women got angry and explained why, cleared up the attributions, then that hit to their status didn't happen. So it's just like interesting, not to say that the stereotypes are clearly the problem here, but it's just the power of clearing up attributional ambiguity in our day-to-day encounters. And I really think that matters a lot in the kind of society we're in now, where there are so many different tribes and groups and so much diversity that the possibilities for misunderstanding are vast.
Yeah. Well, I definitely want to ask you about that, and then also about, I know we'll talk about fundamental attribution error, but just one question when you were saying this. So I'll tell you where I'm going with it, and then I'll give my example. So this idea of belonging can sometimes feel like this amorphous, nebulous kind of thing. Like we know it when we feel it, but sometimes we don't, and sometimes it can be in certain groups and sometimes not. But I guess what is the linkage of that with identity, right? Because I have to imagine there's something there. Here's what I mean. Let me give you an example. So I have plenty of people in my family. Actually, half of my family, my dad and his family, they're immigrants here, right? Yeah, probably by a pretty accurate definition, they would be considered refugees, but it's neither here nor there. Anyways, and there is this idea of, every immigrant story is completely different for various reasons. What time, what the circumstances were from their, country of birth, coming here. There's just, every situation is different. But sometimes what can happen is that there's this idea, and it doesn't have to just be that. It could be someone that moves from, in the United States, since it's so big, if someone moving from, somewhere in Mississippi to Boston, right? That could probably feel like moving to another country, right?
Yeah.
or vice versa, right?
Yeah.
So, but anyways, the point is that there's this idea of, where do I belong?
Yeah.
Right. And again, everyone's integration, assimilation, acculturation, that whole process is going to be different for everybody.
Yeah.
But this idea of what I've heard from people that have lived, if the United States, let's say in this instance, isn't their, country of birth, but they've lived here for a long time, right? Let's say they've lived here over a decade or more. They can feel somewhat torn or pulled of, where do I belong? Because I definitely don't belong in my home country. And this is home now.
Yeah.
But I wasn't born here, and yeah, I've adapted. And, the United States is somewhat different because it's, I know people don't use the melting pot analogy anymore, but it's very diverse. It's very multicultural. We got a lot of different, folks here. So it's a little bit different than going to, a one-to-one kind of from one culture to another culture, because there's so many here. But nevertheless, there can be this, if folks are introspective, like, I don't belong and anywhere, and I have friends or maybe some family members, but it's always very strange, and so there can be this kind of weird gray area, and that feeling of belonging can be somewhat malnourished of sorts.
Yeah.
And I think that does connect in a way with how they identify. They may meaning their identity. They could have their identity of their, all of the particulars, but then temperament and personality and all these things, culture. But that might be this sense of not belonging in one particular discrete category of sorts, can be very disarming in a sense of their evolving identity of sorts. So I don't know. I just throw that example out there, and just, what do you think about that, or make of that?
Yeah. Well, I think that belonging is kind of a lifelong journey for a lot of us. And figuring out where we're at home, who we're at home with, can be, like, as you're suggesting, a pretty creative process. I do think that in the example that you gave, it's interesting because you could be between two groups or have multiple identities that might be in tension with each other. And that can be a strain, make it very difficult to feel like you belong. So there is this research on acculturation, which suggests, the best situation is to be identified with both. You derive a belonging both from your home culture and from the culture that you're immigrating to, and the both together seem to be the most beneficial. So you're not turning away from either source of belonging. You have two rather than one. Right. But in addition, I think there's a kind of way in which, it's one of the interesting things about America is, each group in these cases is kind of creating their own belonging, right? It's like, what does it mean to be an Italian immigrant to America? What does it mean to be a Jewish immigrant to America? How do I be an American? And this is a process that's both a creative and social endeavor that can take generations. But I do think that, maybe this kind of intersectionality between identities raises the challenge of creating new identities and new new identities and new opportunities to belong through these kind of conjunctive sets of identities.
Yeah, no, I firmly agree. I do agree. I think it's like a kind of a evolving thing, which is interesting, because then maybe that would say in a kind of a developmental piece that belonging is always changing, or it's evolving, or there's a and that kind of maps onto a lot of other things for human behavior and who we are as humans, and it's just very fascinating. I guess I want to ask now about the much talked about us versus them. That's what we talk about all the time now, us versus them. Tribalism is very ascendant in some ways, and all these things. And so I guess, would just kind of give us your, I'm just teeing you up here for the whole us versus them thing. I mean, obviously in the social psychology literature, that's been talked about in research for a long time, but, it has, kind of, been pumped with steroids recently. People talk about it.
Yeah.
This whole idea of us versus them, and in certain groups and individuals and things like that. So what do you kind of make of that, I guess?
I think the bottom line is us versus them thinking is not inevitable. I think it's a function of the situations that are laid out for us or that we create for ourselves. A lot of research in social psychology going back to the 40s and 50s demonstrates, for example, that situations of threat, for instance, scarce resources, where I feel like I have to compete with other people or other groups over resources that are scarce or that have been made artificially scarce, is fertile soil for intergroup hostility. By the same token, creating situations where people from antagonistic groups work together, even creating sports teams. One of my colleagues here at Stanford, Sama Musa, does some research just showing even creating integrated sports teams can bridge hostilities between Muslims and Christians in Iraq. The situations that we're in, it's not so much our biology that creates us versus them thinking, though it does make us vulnerable to its being surfaced. But what leads us to dichotomize the world into an us and a them is the situations that we're in, and particularly the main situational trigger to us versus them thinking is the perception of threat.
Well, okay, so let me ask you this way. So I'm thinking about it in the modern sense. So I totally agree, and I'm a big believer in the evolutionary models of things, and so I totally agree about what you're saying. There's a absence of resources, or there's a threat, or it's a scarce. With that 100%. I guess I just wonder. This is something I talked about with Nick Christakis recently, and we talked about. He looks at social networks and all that stuff. And so we were talking, and I said, it seems now that before it was, I think I talked about this with Dominic Packard too, I think as well, of this idea of, before it was, well, here's my group, and here's how we are coalesced together. And we don't like that group. And that was it. But now it seems, and maybe this is the advent and the explosion of social media and interconnectedness of things, which is great, but it has many, many negative sides too, with the internet and things like that, which is now it's people are defining their group by being not only not liking the other group, but to be against in an antagonistic way the other group is what's defining their group. Right? It's the anti.
It's like an oppositional identity.
Yeah. And so we're going to create an identity based on hating the other group. That's our identity, right?
Yeah.
It's not just, well, we like how we do things or whatever. People will have created groups where the whole thing is like, fuck those guys and fuck everything they're about. And that's their whole thing. That's their whole thing. And it's a very antagonistic, a lot of animus. And so that feels to me new. or at least in the modern age, it feels newer. I mean,
Interesting.
But I'm not saying that that's a complete novel thing. I'm sure in different times past we've done it.
We get a lot of help in going there. I think from the media, especially on both sides, framing Republicans, framing Democrats, for example, as threats, and portraying the other side in these broad brushstrokes, like Republicans are this, Democrats are that. And I do feel that the media stokes fear and oppositional identity. And it's partly our fault as psychologists. Psychologists long ago discovered that the experiences that capture our attention are fear, disgust, and outrage. And so the media moguls have just exploited that. And that's what keeps us watching. And so I think we get a lot of help from the media, which helps us, basically leads us to think that mainly the other side is to be feared and loathed. Yeah.
I tell people every day, anytime I open up the Twitter app, it's a exercise in self-control, and it's incredible. I'm definitely not perfect, but I have really worked very hard to do that, and I think I do for the most part. I want to put something positive out in the world and creative, and so. But it's incredible to me seeing, people's careers have ended because they just said too many bad tweets in one time, and so there are these certain things that are, basically pouring gasoline on the fire.
I think that it is a different situation, and it takes a kind of different skill set to interact in this interconnected world, especially if you're in a position of authority or influence. I think you need to be aware that your statements can be taken out of context and can have these horrific effects that you never intended. So I do think that the way in which news now spreads so fast and so denuded of context presents new challenges to people of influence, and that is a skill set. That is a skill set. I also think I don't want to be too pessimistic. I think there are many, many forces that are fragmenting us, from polarization to systemic racism to xenophobia to authoritarian leadership and just so many things. But one of the reasons I wrote this book is because there are so many opportunities for us to fight back in little ways every day, even in the smallest pockets of social life. As one example, I've already done it, which is to speak using words like "I think" that convey the subjectivity of my point of view. In some research with Michael Schwabe, we showed that when people engage in conversations across the political aisle, simply having them express their points of view with that statement, "I think," and making clear that, I'm speaking from a point of view here, just using some linguistic frames, open up people from the other side to learning more, and made the individual doing the talking less likely to villainize the other side. There are these small things that we can do every day, in spite of these powerful forces also in the media, just to make our encounters go better and sow seeds for greater peace.
Yeah, I mean, I think there needs to be a tremendous amount more of epistemic humility, right? Of like, hey, this is just what I'm seeing right now. I mean, it could change. I if I get more information, but here's just kind of my fresh thoughts on this. But again, even that is it's not incentivized that way. Everyone wants the hot take and the immediate dog pile, and that's just
and it's so rewarding.
It's
to say here's how it is
in the short term. In the right, yes, in the short term, it feels sometimes
I've gone
great.
There. Yeah,
and then it's just in the long term, or if you're doing too much of this, it will definitely change you. I think as a person, I think it can really
change you. It
make
will
you
change you.
Very cynical, And I think what it can do sometimes for some folks is it leads them down a conspiratorial kind of rabbit hole, and there's you can see this where people were, quote unquote, normies 2.5-3 years ago, and now you're looking like, what happened? Like, and I think it's
I have friends like that too. It's like, what happened?
Yeah, it's like
I think it is partly, we're talking about how people have increasingly defined themselves in opposition to the other side. I think another problem that's a root cause of this situation is what Lee Ross and others call the objectivity illusion, which is just this tendency to think, I see the world as it is.
Yeah.
I have an objective pipeline to reality. And we fail to realize the degree to which our beliefs and opinions are mentally constructed and susceptible to biases, confirmation bias, availability heuristics. So what that does, it has a kind of really toxic effect, because what happens is we start to interpret the world through the lens of our beliefs, because we think that they're objective reflections of reality. Like, I might think that all people from this political party are evil. Then I start to see evil in the little acts that they do, some of which may be intentional, some of which are unintentional. Then I use that biased interpretation of reality to reinforce my point of view that, all the people in this party are evil. And the cycle continues. And I sink deeper into this belief that is just assimilates grist to its mill through living out daily experience, seeing things through the lens of these beliefs that I believe are objective, when in fact I should have a much more tentative relationship to them. I like Phil Tetlock's research, where he shows that a lot of the people who are the most accurate at forecasting the political future have a much more tentative relationship to their beliefs. They see them as testable hypotheses rather than certitudes.
That's right. Yeah, when Phil's done great work, and I absolutely agree. And that's when you have bad incentives, you have overwhelming access to knowledge at your fingertips, quote unquote knowledge, and you get your emotions involved. It's just a terrible, bad combination. And so, and the instantaneous kind of things and the rewarding of it, it is there are many negatives to it, but obviously there are many positives. I guess the other thing
one of the things, just to kind of springboard off that, one of the things that Michael Schwabe at Stanford shows is the big predictor of susceptibility to fake news is twofold. One is a belief in your own personal objectivity. And number two, excessive exposure to one-sided media. The two in combination are pretty toxic. If you think that you see the world as it is, and you're also imbibing a one-sided view of reality, that sets you up to believe some pretty ridiculous and even dangerous things.
Yeah, it's interesting I talk to a handful of historians on here and read my own history. There's this stuff goes in waves when you look at the broad scale. I mean, at certain points at least in the United States, there was you'd have 3 newspapers in town, and there was like the Democrat newspaper and the Republican newspaper, or whatever it was, and it was very so obviously in your face, without abandon, like, yes, we're the abolitionist paper, and we're the whatever paper. Like, they was just so out there. They weren't trying to hide it. And then it kind of changed a little bit, and then again, as with different technologies and stuff, and then it became this focus on objectivity and neutrality, and not being inhibiting your bias, and that was kind of the standard for a long time. And now with, again, new technology, advent of various types of media, now it's becoming, well, everyone's biased, and no one can trust anyone's sources anymore. It's all fake news or whatever. Yeah. And it's a very interesting thing how, people will, it's really different now in some ways. In some ways, it's kind of always been the same of how people are, what their media diet is of sorts. And so it's a really, I think, always each generation has its own difficulties. But I mean, some of them are similar. But it is always, how do we adjust to those?
And the medium is the message idea, that this whole idea that news is supposed to be entertainment really has, I think, reshaped news and contributed to the problem. Also, the revocation of the fairness doctrine, perhaps, going back to what you said as well. There are many aspects of our situation, our cultural situation, that are dividing us.
Yeah. I want to ask a question here. I read a handful of books by social psychologists, and there's always like the landmark studies you kind of have to hit, throughout the book. It's just, they just, they're just landmark studies. But, what we know is that we're attracted to others who are competent, similar to us, and there's some type of reciprocity, right? I think that's kind of the standard kind of view of this. So I guess, why do we look for these things in other people? And, maybe if you want, you can talk a little bit about Zimbardo's social roles and de-individuation here and things like that, because he was very, very huge in some of this stuff as well. But
yeah, he was a huge influence. Yeah.
Yeah. So what do we make of this?
Well, I don't know if we're attracted to people who are similar to us so much as people who we perceive to be similar to us.
Yes.
And that might be a kind of key distinction. I think the research that I've looked at in, for instance, even interpersonal attraction shows not so much that similarities predict attraction, it's actually the perception of similarity, which is interesting. That means that you can create that perception by finding ways in which our experiences are shared. And there's a few examples of this, even that 36 questions by Aaron and Aaron, where they have people get to know each other by asking and answering questions of gradually increasing intimacy, such that by the end they're asking each other questions like, if this were your last day on earth, what would you want to make sure you told someone? And why haven't you told them this? And by the end, people start to realize, wow, we are actually similar in some really deep ways. It's a perception that's created through a shared psychological experience where I realize, the human things I feel, love, fear, anxiety, are actually shared by this other person. And this experience of 36 questions is robustly replicated. It actually brings people together, even when they begin with very different points of view and opinions on different issues. So I think that perception is the kind of key issue. And one of the big themes in social psychological research is that perception is powerful. I always tell my students, this goes to the Zimbardo study, your prism is your prison. The way you look at the world can either constrain you or liberate you. And I do feel that a lot of the work in social psychology demonstrates how shifting perceptions, not always, but in some circumstances, can unlock people's potential for good, for achievement, for a higher purpose. So I think that that's a really interesting aspect of what it means to connect and to be similar. Is it's not so much objective similarity, but it's the perception of similarity. Now, in the case of Phil Zimbardo, I know his studies come under a lot of criticism of late, but one of the things I do is to go into pretty good depth of that study and what it shows and what it doesn't show. But to make a long story short, I see that study as, and Phil even called it this, a sort of Pirandello prison. The prison isn't a literal prison. It's a psychological prison. People are imprisoned by the roles that Phil asked them to adopt as prisoner or guard. Now, where things get a little complicated is that it wasn't just the role. There were so many other things going on in this situation, including Phil's somewhat authoritarian leadership as the prison warden. But nonetheless, one of the things that I think is so fascinating about that study is that even though some of the people who were assigned to the role of prisoner wanted to leave and did leave, none of the participants who had been assigned to the role of guard left. Even though later they said, yeah, I kind of regretted that. I don't know what, because some of these guards became pretty brutal. That's interesting. The prison was in their own minds. They felt like this was their job. And so I think a lot of these effects of situations are partly about the roles that we feel or that we perceive ourselves as having to play.
Yeah, the perception thing is huge. I mean, it reminds me of the equity theory as well, where if we perceive that we're putting too much into something and someone isn't, or there be the way that people are being rewarded or compensated, whatever the perception, if they perceive there's an imbalance with inputs, outputs, or whatever, that's what is the thing. Whether it actually is or not is almost irrelevant in some ways.
Fairness is a perception, in part, but it's based on reality.
Sure,
You can manipulate it in the short term, but I think in the long term, people pick up on things.
Yeah. I just got one piece on the belonging aspect of this is, what about darker sides of belonging? So this kind of dips into some of the cooperation stuff, but there's a lot of negative aspects of cooperation, right? Everyone talks about cooperation. It's amazing. It's great. And that's true, but it kind of goes to my earlier point. We can band together to belong with somebody or belong as a group to do some pretty terrible things.
Yeah.
So how do we understand and manage people belonging together for maybe, immoral or some pretty pernicious goals or things they're trying to achieve?
Definitely. I mean, the need to belong doesn't really have a moral valence. It can be
right.
twisted to evil purposes, or it can be used to unite us in common purpose. I think both things can happen. It's not a intrinsically good thing, I think, this need to belong, though I do think that in the long run, we do drift towards more connection with one another, that love kind of beats fear, I think. I mean, I might just be an optimist. So one of the things that really struck me in writing this book was that just how much of membership in extremist groups and hate groups is based not so much on the fact that new members actually subscribe to the malevolent ideology of these clubs, but they actually want a place where they belong. I tell the story of C.P. Ellis, who became a Ku Klux Klan Grand Wizard, and he had a really fractured childhood. He felt rejected by his family. He's going through some hard economic times. He felt left behind by his country. He really had no belonging in his life, or no stable belonging. Then he meets a couple members in the KKK, and they bring him to the meeting of its organization, and he gets to go through some of its rituals, and then he's like performing for them and getting a lot of positive feedback. And he says, I started to feel important, like somebody who mattered. And it was that pulled him in. It was that pulled him in. And then the ideology came later. And then fortunately, because of a serendipitous series of events, CP kind of pulled himself out of that club and became a advocate for civil rights, actually years and years later. But the initial draw was the belonging that he felt he lacked in his life. And that's been documented. Of course, it's not that, of course, these extremism and terrorism are incredibly complex, and people go down these paths for a variety of reasons. But I do think, and the research suggests, including research by Ari Kruglansky, who's a pioneer in this area, does suggest that these groups provide a sense of in-group belonging, and that's their appeal. And so that just tells us, wow, if we live in a society where people feel like their need to belong is being defeated, that's going to set us up for a lot of problems. And that might be where we are now. As Pete Buttigieg calls it, we're in a crisis of belonging, and increasingly people feel left behind. They feel disconnected from their communities, and that might be fertile ground for a lot of the problems. That's one of the things I think that belonging as a construct does, is it helps to explain not all, but many of the problems that we're facing today, and ways in which we can make a little bit of a positive difference.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. I think, kind of, I'm not making a comparison, but it's reminding me of, when you were saying, like, it's not, the ideology and stuff kind of comes later. And that's true. I can't remember if it was Paul Bloom or others, or maybe he was an author in the paper, but he talked about, for people connect with religion mostly because it gives them a sense of community and belonging. It's not the dogma and the doctrine and why some people stay there is because of it gives them community and belonging. And I do think, I mean, I'm a secular humanist. I'm an atheist. I don't believe in any religion, but I can see that as a very powerful positive thing with religion. And I think if you get me going, I can rail on a lot of religious dogma. I don't really care, but I do see the immense value that it has for people and connecting with other people and connecting with a group and how long it's been through time and certain types of traditions, which is, I see that as, kind of these rituals as connecting people, big groups through time together in really tough moments. And that's not something to, I think, just completely toss out. And I think there's a lot of power. But again, there's some awful ideas.
The word religion means to bind together.
Yeah.
And I think that is one of its functions.
Mm-hmm.
Often they have in them, with some religions, a belief system that is actually very creative of human connection, right? Mm-hmm. That idea that I should love thy neighbor, right? These outlooks actually create more connection and more unity. And that's why I think maybe the arc of human history orients towards love, because it's just much more likely for that kind of attitude to propagate itself. Mm-hmm. And for, faith creates connection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a little bit of Christakis' view. I think Michael McCullough's view is kind of the same way. He also has this kind of view as well. So yeah, I see a lot of value in that. So let's just talk real quick about the fundamental attribution error. You mentioned it a lot in your book, and I think it's super important. I think the pragmatic aspects of how you describe it. You're more well prepared to talk about. I can as well, but I usually think of the fundamental attribution error, the actor-observer effect, and the self-serving bias. There's all these kind of sort of little nuances there. If you want to talk about all three of them, you can, or just the fundamental attribution error. But just kind of tell us, what it is, and kind of, again, it's not entirely, this moral good or bad, but that it does get us into trouble a lot, and we should try to manage it well. So just lay that out first.
I would love if the only impact I have is to make the world more aware of the fundamental attribution error. I think that would be one of the best things we could do to help to cultivate more belonging in the world.
Be huge.
Yeah. And this is a term coined by my colleague Lee Ross. He gave the error its name. It refers to our reflexive tendency to think that what really drives behavior is things inside of a person, their character, their abilities, their traits, and to underestimate the importance of circumstance, especially subtle social circumstances. Mm-hmm. So the fundamental attribution error is dealing with the way that we attribute to what do we attribute other people's behavior, and we tend to over-attribute people's behavior to internal dispositions, and we tend to under-attribute it to the circumstances that they're in. Now, one example that just stuck with me was the example of an actor who, I forgot his name, but he was playing, he had a role, he was on set with Chadwick Boseman, who played the Black Panther. Mm-hmm. And the actor said, when I met Chadwick Boseman, I was like, I just thought he was the most conceited person I had ever met. There he was getting massages from a therapist, and his girlfriend was holding his hand the whole time. And I just thought he was just full of himself and demanding excessive pampering. But he didn't know his full circumstance. He was actually dying, as he found out later, of stage 4 colon cancer. Right. And his situation was just in extreme pain. You couldn't see that. And I think that that's a lovely little anecdote about how there's often much more going on behind the scenes in a person's life than we can actually see. Yeah, people are complicated, but actually, a lot of times their situations are a lot more complicated than we think. And so I think the fundamental attribution error gets us into so much trouble when we're, as managers, we're blaming employees for underproductivity by thinking that they lack a work ethic, or we think that students from stereotype groups are lazy. We are constantly taking off the shelf these internal dispositions to explain why people are the way they are, which actually often worsens the problem. It makes the problem worse by ostracizing people or making people feel ostracized and villainized, which just contributes to the crisis of belonging and fuels the problems that we're trying to fix, I think.
Yeah. I totally agree. I mean, it happens all the time, and I think it's another exercise in self-control, but it's trying to see the humanity in other people. Right?
Yes.
And you don't have to dig that deep. You just have to say, well, wait a minute. Maybe this person is, maybe they just got a phone call and it just totally rocked their world, and like they're trying to sort it out while they're at work or whatever. Maybe it's not because of something I said or did. And it takes 10 seconds. The example that's always given is, you're driving and the guy cuts you off. You're like, oh, this asshole, blah, blah, blah. But, maybe his wife's in the front seat in labor about to give birth, and he's got to get to the hospital, and he doesn't care that he cut anybody off because, and it's like, well, if I knew that, and it's like, but you don't have to necessarily. Now, that doesn't mean that it always is that case, but that we should be able to say, wait a minute, it seems this way, but there could be other things. Let me wait before I start, jumping to this kind of attribution. I'll just say about the other two.
It's well said.
You tell me if I'm wrong on it. But so fundamental attribution error is typically about how we view others. The actor-observer effect is usually how we see a difference between ourselves and others.
Yes.
That there's different sets of rules, and then that the self-serving bias is very much how it sounds. Well, yes. I did this. What I was able to do here was because of my dispositional qualities. This is my ability and, my skill set or whatever. And this person is, well, that's that must be something about, them and their negative qualities. But, if I make a mistake, that was the situation. I mean, that wasn't about me necessarily. So it's this kind of way in which we're always kind of, or many times seeing ourselves for the good things we do, the positive actions for something about us. And when we're negative things or our mistakes or slip ups, well, it's situational or whatever.
That's right.
Typically how it works. And so these things all kind of play along with each other in not so good ways. And so that can be problematic in our interactions with other people.
Yeah, it does suggest, though, that one of my old professors said, empathy is an act of the imagination. I think that really, speaks to this idea that, if you're faced with someone who's behaving in a way that you find objectionable, as you're suggesting, try to imagine what could be the cause of it, and ask yourself what might be some of the circumstantial causes that you may not see readily. And, there's some research by Deb Buchenthal and others just that demonstrates that you can actually retrain people to stop committing the fundamental attribution error, at least in some pretty specific domains. And just by asking people to, when they're considering someone else's behavior, to encourage them to ask themselves, well, what in the circumstance may have been contributing to this? And so through these kinds of mental calisthenics, you can kind of break free. And Deb Buchenthal finds that sort of training actually reduces child abuse, actually, in her study. So then in the case of the actor-observer difference, that refers to the very simple terms, we tend to understand the effects of circumstances on ourselves much more readily than we understand the effects of circumstances on other people. And so that's just a kind of bridge for empathy that, maybe when we see someone behaving objectionably, we can try to imagine ourselves as having done that and imagine what in our circumstances might have led us to do that we might start sort of put ourselves in the role of the other person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I want to get to the third part of your book, which I thought was really cool. You basically set everything up in the first part of the book. Many of the things we've been talking about is in the second part of the book, and then the third part of the book you give, I think it's 4 chapters, I think, with certain areas, at work, at school, and a few other areas. So I want to get to that, but maybe just before we get there, if you just kind of want to give us the groundwork for just kind of explaining prejudice and stereotype threat and biases, and maybe just set that up of where what those things are, and then we can kind of look at the specific areas where it plays out.
In broad brushstrokes, the second section lays out various causal roots to our crisis of belonging, and those range from the situations that we're in our society, social media, the media, but also cognitive biases such as the fundamental attribution error, which leads us to ostracize and villainize people who behave in ways we don't like. Also stereotypes and prejudice. Around the world, stereotypes are used to break the world into an us who belongs and a them who doesn't. That's another big contributor to the crisis of belonging, and something that we can fight against in our day-to-day lives. And also stereotype threat, which was pioneered by my mentor, Claude Steele, is all about the ways in which even when we're in a situation where we're not being stereotyped, the mere possibility that we could be stereotyped makes us uneasy and vulnerable to belonging uncertainty. If I'm in a situation as an academic and I'm invited to a sports competition, and I'm aware that people look down on academics as athletically inept, that's going to affect my belonging, even if nobody's even treating me differently. Claude and others have demonstrated the power of that predicament in partly explaining why people underperform at work and at school. The difficulty, or one of the painful things about prejudice, is that you have to be thinking about it even when it doesn't happen. Simply being aware that you could be stereotyped is psychologically taxing. So those are the kind of building blocks or the root causes for the crisis of belonging that I go into, or ways we misread people as well. And then I set it up, and then in the final part 3 of the book, I try to apply those various frames to understanding specific social arenas such as work, school, healthcare, politics.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, we've touched a little bit on the politics already, but I thought that was a really nice piece of the book, because a lot of stuff is, research or some theoretical underpinnings, and it's really hard to get some of the pragmatics of some of this stuff, or it's the opposite. Books will be written and it's all just pragmatics, and it's very, a little too self-help or something. But
yes,
which your book is none of that in those terrible stereotypical ways. But
there's nothing so practical as a good theory. Kurt Lewin said. The most useful thing is looking at your life differently.
Love it. Yeah, that's great. So maybe we'll just hit a few real quick. So I guess in schools, I talked about this with the name's escaping me. She wrote this book called Undoing Bias. She's a developmental psychologist. Oh my God, her name's escaping me. Christia Spears Brown, that's her name. There it is.
Okay.
Oh, yes, I was blanking for a minute. And we talked about this, and she does, she's developmental. She does a lot of stuff in schools and everything. And so we talked about what can be done about trying to reduce certain biases that kids will have in primary school or secondary or whatever. Which was really interesting, and it's just, there's a little bit of overlap here in these conversations. She didn't call it this, but there is some type of stereo or situational kind of building and things like that. So I guess from your side of things, how do you foster belonging in schools at different levels? That's going to look different. So at an undergrad campus, that might look different than in a kindergarten classroom. But how do we sort of try to foster belonging in schools, and how does that connect with minimizing bullying and not encouraging cliques and stuff like that? And so what are your thoughts on that?
I would break it down into 3 core messages of belonging, at least in school, but maybe elsewhere. And those 3 core messages are: you are seen, you have potential, and you are not alone. And if you can successfully convey all three, then that is a climate in which students will feel that they can belong and will be more likely to thrive. There are three different kind of sources of belonging. So you are seen. One example of this is research on what my colleagues and I, Claude Steele as well, call values affirmation, which shows that the simple activity of asking students to reflect on their important values. I want to get to know you. What are your values? What do you care about? That helps students to feel like they belong. Partly because they feel like their full self is seen, and research by Eric Smith and Greg Walton and others suggests that. So that's one strategy for helping students to feel seen. And insofar as schools and teachers can do that, that's a good thing. Feeling like you are seen as an individual. Also, you have potential. We talked about this earlier, but wise criticism. When teachers give feedback in an empowering way, I'm giving you this critical feedback because I believe in your potential to reach a higher standard. It's much more effective, sometimes surprisingly effective. In that study that I mentioned earlier, where we had teachers give feedback in that way in a randomized controlled trial, the children who received that criticism that was empowering were even more likely years and years later, in research by David Jager, we found, to go on to college. Just getting that one message from teachers at a key formative period in their lives, early adolescence, set them up for a trajectory of success. Then you are not alone. A lot of the interventions that, let's call it, I don't actually like the word interventions. A lot of the situations that we've crafted to empower students involve sending this message that, when you start a new challenge, maybe you're entering middle school, maybe you're entering college or high school, it's normal to feel like you don't belong.
Sure. Yeah.
But with time, things get better. You are not alone turns out to be a really empowering message as well. Because one of the things that is really awful is shame, feeling like I'm the only one who feels like a joke here. I'm the only one who feels like they don't belong. I remember experiencing this keenly as an assistant professor. I felt like the worst professor on campus. And just knowing that, it's normal to feel like you don't belong, especially when you're transitioning from one environment to another where the standards have risen. That's enormously helpful. So those three messages, insofar as schools can send them, turn out to be really empowering, or turn out to be really conducive to a general sense of belonging. And in school, it seems that a sense of belonging is probably the number one predictor of academic outcomes, but not just academic outcomes, adolescent risk behavior as well. So many things are kind of bundled together under that are predicted by a sense of belonging or not belonging. So I would say that those are the three things that I think are core in schools.
Yeah. And what about in the workforce? So this is obviously very different. It's a different, you're not being evaluated in the same way. I mean, you are, but it's obviously a different context and such. And there's so many things going on in the workforce. So many good things, so many bad things.
I think a lot of the same things apply. We did a study with one Silicon Valley firm where we just gave new employees testimonials from older employees saying, when I first got here, I really felt like I didn't belong, but with time it got better. And we found, actually, this was reported to us by the company's internal review office, that experience erased the morale decline that they typically observed among female employees, that their morale maintained itself over the course of their first year at work. So I think a lot of the same same strategies apply. Also, in terms of being seen, managers who ask a lot of questions. There's this great little paper about just how good managers ask good questions. They take an interest in employees. They want to know their perspective. They want to know employees' points of view. They want them to contribute. That goes a long way to fostering belonging at the workplace.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's in I think it's the IO literature. Is it Shine or Shane, where he talks about espouse beliefs and basic underlying assumptions and, rules and artifacts. And there's this way in which culture is created in a workplace environment. And there's ways in which people can try to, foster this way of belonging. right?
Yeah.
Where there's norms, where there's, histories and stories, and kind of what you're saying, kind of the older folks that have worked there older meaning, that have been there longer.
One of the best things we can do is mentorship programs where Bhuji Dasgupta has a nice study just showing that, if you if you give people an experience with a good mentor who, addresses some of these questions of belonging, struggles are normal. You'll get over them with time and with strategy, and who's there just to support the person. That's one of the best things you can do to improve retention.
Yeah. So here's my last question. It's about, I guess like two questions, but last question is, so we talked about many, many things. And one of the things we talked about not so long ago was about fighting this fundamental attribution error. And you give a lot of suggestions in I think the last chapter of the book. I guess my question is how do we scale this, right? We can do this in small groups of people, maybe, people we know or people we interact with, but how do we scale this to even larger groups and bigger places? I mean, that's always, I think, when you're trying to find generalizability, it can be somewhat difficult sometimes. So how do we do that? How do we scale it? How do we create a broader culture of belonging?
The more we do it, the more we create it. Faith creates. Not that I'm religious, but I do believe that small things add up to huge benefits when we all do them. And I think these little things, I mean, the work suggests that we have a kind of superpower, and in our day-to-day lives to create and foster one another's belonging with sometimes having, we're often going to fail. We're often going to fail. Sure. We're often going to fail to de-escalate, and things will escalate. Yet, once in a while, we'll make the situation a lot better and change the trajectory. And so I don't really see the problem of scaling up as a problem of disseminating all these interventions and treatments. That's not what I think is key here. I think what's key is raising awareness, changing people's outlook, beware of the fundamental attribution error. Fight the fundamental attribution error. Have a growth mindset for yourself and for other people. Use these strategies of values affirmation. Politeness turns out to be a very effective way to nurture one another's belonging, something that's kind of gone out the window in a lot of our civic life. Sharing stories, mentoring. There are all these ways, a multitude of tools, norms, social norms, democratic leadership. There's a multitude of tools that we can use in our day-to-day lives to make our own situations and each other's a little bit better. And if we all do them, it could be a lot better.
Well, that was going to be my last question is, what do you want people to get from the book? But I think you just adequately stated it. I think that's it. That's how I read it.
I hope they get hope, but I am aware that hope is not a strategy. But the book is also full of strategies.
Yes, it certainly is. Especially it's throughout, but definitely the back half, which I really, really valued. Well, look,
thank you.
It's been fantastic talking with you. The book is called Belonging: The Science of Creating Connection and Bridging Divides. Where can people find this, and where can people find you?
The book is available at all the usual sites, and at bookstores. And if people are interested in more, they can go to my website, geoffreylcohen.com.
That's wonderful. Well, look, Geoffrey, I've had such a wonderful time talking with you. It's always nice to read a book, really enjoy it, and then be able to talk to the person that wrote it and put all the hard work into it. And so I think it's really, really great stuff that you're doing. You're really doing good research, and we need more people like you writing really good books like this. So I just I can't thank you enough for coming on and talking, and I'm very positive that listeners will enjoy it greatly.
Thank you so much, Xavier, for having me on the show and for engaging in this delightful, stimulating conversation. Many thanks.
Thank you.